Good afternoon, committee. Thank you for your indulgences. Mondays are always days that we get caught up, and now finally on week 5 we are moving forward with a lot of different things. So just a housekeeping order. We're not planning on meeting on any Fridays, but we will plan on meeting the next these next couple Thursdays. So depending on what Friday brings, the big picture, would like to have you around next week. We're going to be doing a lot of our bills and then working the bills. So we're still not. We're planning on working some bills next Thursday, and then we have and then after next week we'll have a couple days left. So then we will take final action on them. So just be aware. So we will also be meeting the next couple of Mondays as well. So just wanted to do that. So this is also the last day for bill introductions in this committee. Do we have any bill introductions? Seeing none, we will move on. Today we will have a hearing on Senate resolution, the joint resolution 1602, and we have lots of folks that want to testify. And so with that, we'll call on Kyle Hamilton to give a brief overview of what this resolution entails.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Senate Concurrent Resolution 1602 would resolve that the Kansas Legislature, 1, disapproves the designation of the lesser prairie chicken as a threatened species in Kansas by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and 2, that the legislature supports the passage of Congress's Senate Joint Resolution 70 and House Joint Resolution 105. This concurrent resolution is not binding in and of itself, but it serves as a formal declaration of the wishes of the legislature of the state of Kansas. Under the federal government's Congressional Review Act, if either of the congressional joint resolutions were to pass Congress and be signed by the president, the disputed regulation would be deemed to not have had any effect at any time. With that, I'd be happy to stand for any preliminary questions.
Any procedural questions or things for Kyle? Seeing none, thank you. Before we get to our testimony for proponents, opponents, or neutral, we would like to bring in Kent Fricke with Wildlife and Parks. He's their small game coordinator, and he will give us, kind of the overview, some history and things from Wildlife and Parks. So, Mr. Fricke, thanks for being to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you mentioned, I'm Kent Fricke. I'm the small game coordinator from the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks and work out of our Emporia Research and Survey office. I coordinate research and survey efforts for upland game birds and turkeys in Kansas, and I am our primary point of contact for lesser prairie chickens. The lesser prairie chicken is a grouse species that occurs in 5 states: Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, and Oklahoma. It is a ground nesting bird, slightly smaller than a pheasant, that is well known for its elaborate mating displays in the spring. In Kansas, the species range covers most of the western third of the state. Lesser prairie chickens require large tracts of intact grassland to maintain robust populations. They have a boom and bust reproductive strategy in that when quality habitat is available, several years of poor reproductive success may be offset by 1 or 2 years of good productivity. Lesser prairie chickens are highly influenced by vertical structures, especially during the nesting season when they avoid trees, power lines, communication towers, and other vertical features on the landscape. In addition to existing rangelands, lesser prairie chickens are highly reliant on fields enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP, especially during drought years. Lesser prairie chicken populations have declined as intact grasslands in the southern Great Plains have been reduced in size and become more fragmented. The population low point occurred in 2013 following several years of severe drought in the southern Great Plains. While populations are currently higher than 10 years ago, the current drought is again driving population declines. Approximately 80% of the lesser prairie chicken population occurs in Kansas. The lesser prairie chicken has a long history of conservation concern associated with the Endangered Species Act. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was first petitioned to list the species in 1995. It then held the status of warranted but precluded from listing for over 16 years before it was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 2014. In 2015, the listing was vacated, but the Fish and Wildlife Service was again petitioned to list the species in 2016. In 2021, the service proposed to list the lesser prairie chicken as threatened in the northern portion of its range, which includes the Kansas populations, and endangered in the southern portions of its range in Texas and New Mexico. In November 2022, the Fish and Wildlife Service finalized this decision with now an effective listing date of March 27, 2023. The Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks coordinates with other state wildlife agencies to implement standardized range-wide surveys of the lesser prairie chicken population, as well as our own state-based ground surveys. We coordinate closely with the Fish and Wildlife Service on all aspects of lesser prairie chicken policy and work with our conservation partners and landowners to coordinate and inform policy decisions. In coordination with our partners, we implement conservation actions throughout the lesser prairie chicken range, and we work closely with the Farm Services Agency, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, Fish and Wildlife Service Partners for Fish and Wildlife Programs, non-governmental organizations, and our own Habitat First habitat program to ensure conservation programs are targeted to areas most likely to improve lesser prairie chicken habitats. Thank you for the opportunity to present this information.
All right, thank you, Mr. Fricke. Would you be available for questions? Any questions? Representative Blex.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. Do you feel like that some of the past conservation agreements amongst the different states that we've had prior to them listing, and most of those were on a voluntary basis, but at least the states got together and developed a plan, and now we're seeing the feds kind of ignoring that. Do you, in your own mind and your professional experience, feel like that those voluntary conservation measures and as well as a cooperative agreement between states would have brought this population back? I know that their grouse are historically cyclic, sometimes as much as 25 years. Do you feel like that program would have brought them back or not?
Yes, certainly we feel like that conservation actions and certainly voluntary actions are needed and have been important during the last 10 years since the last listing and vacatur of that decision. And that's really what it's going to take. Even if the bird is listed, the voluntary conservation actions are the only thing that's going to really bring back the species, at least in either maintaining or increasing populations. And so we do everything we can in coordination with the other states, the other 4 states in the range, and again, work closely with all of our conservation partners to leverage as many funds and habitat programs as we can, specifically in the lesser prairie chicken range.
With the cost share programs put on by NRCS, have you felt like, you know, they're getting an extra incentive to enroll conservation programs in that? Has there been a fairly good acceptance by producers in those areas, or is that just kind of not so good?
Not being an NRCS employee, I don't know the exact numbers, but I think in general that, you know, certainly the NRCS and FSA continue to modify those programs as they get more information, as they try new things going forward. For example, one of the primary concerns for lesser prairie chickens is vertical structures and specifically trees in the eastern portion of the range. And NRCS just rolled out their Great Plains Grassland Initiative, focused specifically on cutting trees, and all that's focused on greater prairie chickens and lesser prairie chickens in the western part of the state. And so I think that's just another example of trying to tailor incentives and conservation programs to the needs of the species.
Okay, one more.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If we could get several of these programs in line and going, do you have any kind of an idea of a timeline that we may be looking at to increase? And I realize it's going to be rain is going to be the golden bullet. Could they recover to some even low population numbers in 5 years?
I think there's always that potential. And as you mentioned, one of the significant issues in the Southern Great Plains is precipitation. But the key from a habitat management standpoint and a state wildlife agency standpoint is making sure that the habitat is there in the years that we get the wet cycle, right? And so I think there's always that potential. As I mentioned, they are a boom bust species that when the rain and specifically when the habitat is there, they have those opportunities. As I mentioned, we're tailoring conservation reserve program to be in those areas, and we found that, especially in drought years, that CRP land is important to maintaining those populations. And then finally, again, Kansas is driving the population average right now. The shortgrass region in western Kansas is what's keeping the population high. The problem is we just need to keep building and building, and some of the other portions of the range, specifically in the southern portion, have some significant concerns just because of isolation as well.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Representative Roth?
Who petitions the U.S. Wildlife Service?
There was 3 organizations that petitioned the Fish and Wildlife Service in the most recent listing, or the most recent petition back in 2015, and those are environmental groups. I believe Wild Earth Guardians and Center for Biological Diversity, and I'm blanking on the third at the moment, but I can get that back to you.
Thanks for the presentation. Thank you, sir.
Representative Minix?
I want to try to illustrate that even the federal government sometimes has cross purposes. CRP grass, if through the NRCS programs, if a landowner rents that to a new and beginning farmer, the owners of the land get to receive an additional CRP payment. And those types of things were done to encourage new and beginning farmers to be able to start operations. So even Representative Blex illustrated some of the good things we're doing. Every once in a while we do something that doesn't help our habitat in some ways. In far western Kansas, most of our range is very short grass. And during droughts, it's extremely short grass. The CRP is one of our main habitats. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
Other questions? Representative Roth?
Do you think that, you mentioned structures and trees and probably telephone lines and stuff like that, hawks and owls have any play on the numbers of those prairie chickens?
They certainly can. We do not know the exact reason that prairie chickens avoid those vertical structures in the landscape, but we know emphatically that they do. And so certainly a predator avoidance can be maybe what's driving some of that behavior, but again, we don't know for sure. And certainly from the research that we've conducted, predation specifically from avian predators, as you're mentioning, is a significant portion. But at the same time, it's not any different than pheasants or quail or other species, ground nesting species.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Frigga, for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, now we'll go on to proponent, opponent, neutral testimony. Up first will be Jim Sipes from the Kansas Farm Bureau. Mr. Sipes, welcome to committee.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers and members of the committee, for the opportunity to stand before you this morning or this afternoon and provide testimony in favor of SCR 1602. My name is Jim Sipes, and I am speaking to you today on behalf of Kansas Farm Bureau. I am the 9th District Director on Kansas Farm Bureau, and I represent the very southwest corner of Kansas, which is in the sagebrush ecosystem for the lesser prairie chicken. I'm a 5th-generation farmer down there where I farm in Stanton and Morton counties in Kansas, and I'm a reluctant expert on the lesser prairie chicken, and I'm also known for drought, and I would love to be known for anything other than lesser prairie chickens and drought. I have served Kansas Farm Bureau for about the last 10 years, working with members of other organizations across the 5-state region where the lesser prairie chicken historic range has been, trying to develop ways to provide habitat on an incentive-based basis for farmers and ranchers to increase the population of the species while preserving farming and ranching income. So that's what we really stand for here in Kansas Farm Bureau, is to find incentive-based efforts to provide habitat. My experience with the lesser prairie chicken has led me to understand that the Endangered Species Act is not very good at preserving species. We've had over 2,400 species listed, but only 53 have been removed from the list. And many of those probably shouldn't have been listed to begin with. So I would much rather see incentive-based habitat provided for species, and I think that's the way we recover them and to be successful. I appreciate your time. We do speak in favor of this, and I would stand for questions.
Any questions for Mr. Sipes? One twice? You did a great job then. Wow.
Thank you.
So, well, you're not, you haven't been informed my committee yet, you know.
This is true.
You can't just, you traveled a long way, so want to make sure, you know, you raised the, you know, filled the wagon up twice. But talk about, we had Representative White from Clark County talk about just the impact it had on his operation and just the whole physical, not necessarily toll per se, but, you know, the impact. And we know all too well the area that you're from, combating even on good years, you're dry. So I guess what, you know, obviously when it rains, that happens, but even when it rains in Stanton County, it doesn't rain like it does in the east. So as far as suggestions or what can be done, other than just kind of let us, we know what's best in our area, is that kind of the attitude we should probably have?
Well, I think farmers and ranchers know what's best for their grazing lands, and I think that's, you know, in our hands. And in an incentive-based habitat program, I think we can figure out ways to overcome the droughts. You know, I had an idea on the way up here. I know in developing nations that suffer from drought, like in Africa, we have things that suck, basically compress air and produce water for folks. We could do that for species and provide them with the water necessary to survive through droughts. We've had good habitat out in western Kansas because of the CRP program. I worry that with the CRP reduction in the western part of the state, that we will see declines in this species, and that we may eventually in some regions of Kansas end up with an endangered listing if we don't figure out how to provide the habitat necessary. And it's really a weather-related problem. It's not the lack of habitat. My county is 25% CRP. The neighboring counties are 25% CRP. We have a lot of habitat. What we need is water.
Very good. Questions? Representative Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I understand things correctly, down in the southwest, there is quite a large amount of national grazing land there. And I assume that is controlled by federal people. And so has there been any attempt to preserve that habitat? And have we seen any positive response from the federal control of that land as far as it relates to preservation of this species?
The national grasslands is what you're speaking of in Cimarron National Grasslands, and it is a large grassland area that is very good for lesser prairie chicken habitat. In my many years that I've worked with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I've always brought up that as, why don't we designate that as lesser prairie chicken habitat? And the response I usually get is, we already control that land, we need more. So I believe in somewhat this is a control issue. There are lesser prairie chickens available on the national grasslands. They are reduced. We've seen less open water in the natural grasslands because of depletion of the aquifer. So again, I believe it's a water issue as much as anything. But it is a good natural grasslands, and I think it would be a prime habitat that we ought to be really enforcing, putting species out there. I think it would be perfect.
Representative Blex.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know farmers are good stewards. I farm, I run cattle, do some cultivated crops. I'm also a professional wildlife biologist, retired, and I try to do the right thing. However, when my back's to the wall and I have a bank payment I do stupid things maybe in terms of conservation. And, you know, the issue is while a lot of producers understand and try to do things, they sometimes don't understand the biological issue like habitat fragmentation. And that impacts certainly on the lesser. And, you know, I think really the key, and like we both said, it's rain, rain, rain is the answer. And I guess my concern on this particular resolution would be the fact that we're being pushed to do something by at the federal level that really most of the state level and most of the individuals don't want to do, or at least want some more time. And maybe more time is not the right answer. I mean, we could end up, if this drought continues, we could end up with a species that may not be here. But having said that, I think it's important for us to tailor programs that we know will work to do it. And, you know, the population on the Cimarron National Grasslands ought to be a good enough, with 100,000 acres, you ought to have a good enough size to be able to understand what is decent habitat. And producers ought to have the ability to look at that and say, hey, this is what we need to do on my land. Now, obviously, a lot of that's not possible economically because somebody else is paying the bills out there. We are in this room, and this being managed by taxpayers. And while producers are subsidized, in some ways, it's not always enough. And certainly, we've experienced a huge drought in the southeast portion of the state, first time in probably 50 years that we've seen like we had. I mean, and I've got all my ponds fenced out. I have waterers below it, which is good conservation. Water quality, benefits cows, everything else. And I about cried when I had to make a management decision to open the gate to turn them into a pond that had never had cattle in it, been built for 6 or 7 years, knowing full well they're going to really do a lot of damage to it. And yet we have to make, I mean, those decisions are being made. So in some ways I can say I'm a good steward and I try to do what's right, but yet sometimes I don't always pay the bills. So we get our backs to the walls, and that's the issue here now. And now we're being pushed, and we have to either push back and try to get some relief or accept what we're being shoved at us. So thank you for your testimony.
I do believe, sir, that a carrot is a lot better for getting farmers and ranchers to do that than a club. And I think if we can provide adequate incentives, we can provide habitat.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. Up next, Jackie Garagiola with the Kansas Livestock Association. Welcome to committee.
Thank you.
The new name.
Have to adjust this a little bit, or a lot. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to be here today to testify in support of SCR 1602. As was said, new name, I'm Jackie Garagiola, formerly Newland, and I represent the Kansas Livestock Association and our over 5,700 members across the state. I won't take up too much of your time today. Jim covered it great. KLA is also in support of voluntary incentive-based conservation programs. So I'll skip down to a very specific part of our testimony, which is the 4D rule. KLA policy specifically supports the inclusion of a 4D rule that provides the same protections given to cultivated lands, but without the requirement of a grazing plan approved by a third party. It's our members' belief that this is a gross federal overreach into the way that private landowners run their businesses. Not only is the service outsourcing its compliance activities to unknown and, in our opinion, potentially unfriendly third parties, but the service has yet to provide any or designate any third parties. And so that's one of our biggest concerns. We're not being treated the same as other cultivated lands here for grazing lands that have made huge strides in conservation over the years. So with that, I really will not take up much of your time, but I would be happy to stand for questions.
Questions for Jackie? Since we'll see you more, we won't put you in the hot seat like we did to Mr. Sipes. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Also, Ed Cross with Cuyahoga, he was with us earlier, kind of on our informal, and kind of gave some testimony. The testimony is in. You have it again. if you want to review. He is available if anybody has any more questions for Kansas Independent Oil and Gas Association. But again, he spoke to us earlier, but we asked him to kind of be in the audience in case if there were more questions. And those are the proponents. Is there anyone else here to speak as a proponent of this resolution? Seeing none, we will go to the opponents, and up first in oral will be Jack Pastora. Sierra Club.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Zach Pastora, representing the fine folks of the Kansas Sierra Club, about 5,000 members across the state, dedicated to protecting our beautiful home and the great outdoors. You heard from me previously, so I won't belabor the point, but the Sierra Club and our Kansas chapter do not oppose the listing of the lesser prairie chicken as threatened for our territory. We think that it is due for protection and enforcement full of law. We do appreciate the voluntary efforts of our farm stewards and our agency dedicated to protecting wildlife in our great state. But we realize that at some point we have to have more enforcement measures. When the carrot's not working, sometimes you got to get out the club, metaphorically speaking, to make sure that people are trying to get in line and all that. And again, that's nothing against our farmers and ranchers, but in just thinking about what we just heard today, that farmers are good stewards, I would agree, and many of our members are farmers or producers, and certainly I come from a farm family. I always recognize farmers as being a great steward of the land, but we do know that over time, habitat destruction and fragmentation, just by the nature of what we're doing, plowing fields and disking and making habitat into farm fields, does have an impact on the ecosystem and the species. We realize that. So that's something for us to think about. I think back to the American bison and how we went from millions of the American bison down to just a few thousand. And if we didn't have protections of the law, if we didn't have say in the stop, let's rehabilitate the species, let's have some rigorous conservation efforts, we might have lost that American bison. And so these species are indicators of our larger ecosystem. I just want to remind the committee that we wouldn't be in our position today if we had some proactive conservation efforts long ago, not just when things get really dire, but long ago. And so I think we're getting there. We're recalibrating our strategy on incorporating much more conservation efforts into our agriculture today. And so I look forward. You had the presentation last Thursday I thought was really inspiring about how we can marry conservation efforts with agriculture, protect the aquifer and our ecosystems and threatened species. And so with that, I just want to say a few things that maybe haven't been said thus far, is that this is only going to get harder. We know that scientists say that we're likely to lose a lot more endangered species. They become threatened. We'll have more hit the Endangered Species Act with climate change. And there's things we can do about that, put cover on the land, try to take the carbon out of the air and put it back in the soil, stop the draining of our aquifer and our surface waters, and maybe we can make a big difference in all that. So you've heard all this from me before, but I just wanted to get up and stand in opposition. Let me just say one more thing, if I may, Chairman. You know, what we should do is a resolution to support a better farm bill for Kansans. About 80%, roughly 80% of our conservation applications, Kansans that wanted to actually do an environmental quality incentives program or a conservation stewardship program, weren't funded. So we had Kansans who weren't able to get those incentive programs to help with conservation on their property. That's a shame. We get about $1 billion in payments every year from the Farm Bill. 80% of that goes to commodity crops and crop insurance. I'm not saying those are important, but if we incorporated more dollars to our conservation programs, maybe we could avoid situations like we have today with the lesser prairie chicken. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Questions for Zach? Thank you off the hook today. Thank you so much for
Appreciate
being
it.
here. You also will find written testimony from Leslie Mark, a citizen, So that is also in your file of papers. Anyone else here as an opponent to the resolution? Seeing none, we will now go to neutral, and we have Justin Cobb from the Nature Conservancy. Justin, welcome back to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee for this opportunity to provide neutral testimony on SCR 1602. As the Chair said, my name is Justin Cobb. I represent the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is a nonpartisan conservation nonprofit that works to conserve the land and waters that all life depend on. Here in Kansas, we conserve just over 150,000 acres of land and water. And we participate in a number of conservation efforts, including habitat manage and the habitat of the lesser prairie chicken. In particular, one of our preserves in Logan County is the Smoky Valley Ranch. It's 18,000 acres of shortgrass prairie. And in 2022, we had 203 leks on it during mating season. There's a pretty healthy population out there. So a lot's been said about the lesser prairie chicken, and really my goal here today is to provide a little bit of our private, on-the-ground conservation experience to you all. So we talked a little bit about the numbers and how the population has ebbed and flowed the lesser prairie chicken. We'd like to take it back about 50 years from where we are now. As we heard earlier, the lesser prairie chicken was warranted a status as endangered in 1998. This is because in 1970, the state wildlife agencies of the 5 states told us that there were 325,000 lesser prairie chickens, and by 1997, they said that there were only 50. That was an 85% drop in 27 years. And over the past 50 years, the 2022 numbers from WAFWA, the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, put us at 26,000 in 2022. So when we talk about the plight of the lesser prairie chicken, we are talking about a long-term numbers. It is recognized as a boom and bust species, so a 5-year trend doesn't warrant concern. A 50-year trend is something to look at. And if you actually read the Fish and Wildlife listing, it's not the population from the past decade isn't really the concern. It is the habitat. It is the loss of over 90% of the viable habitat for this species of grouse that is the concern for Fish and Wildlife. And there are 3 main causes that are causing that wildlife to go away, that habitat to go away. The first one of those is direct loss of grassland. This is pretty simple. Whenever we build houses, neighborhoods, whenever we convert grassland to cropland, we're taking that grassland away, and it's not usually going to come back unless you reconvert it. And to be honest, that's kind of a hard habitat loss to stop. Humans take up space. The more humans we have, the less habitat we have for other species. The second one is indirect loss of grassland habitat. These are those vertical structures that we've heard about. Whenever we build infrastructure, whether that be to capture energy or to produce agriculture, it takes away habitat from lesser prairie chicken. And I think we have a gas and oil man here, so I'll pick on wind instead. For every wind turbine, there's about 3 miles of road associated with every wind turbine. Lesser prairie chickens will nest within a 1/4 mile of that road. So when you think about how many wind turbines we have, that's just fragmentation at that grassland, which would otherwise be perfectly healthy. And the last one is degradation of what would otherwise be good habitat. So this comes to when we overgraze, when we don't use burning practices properly, we end up with things like woody encroachment that provide those vertical structures and hurt the grasslands that those lesser prairie chickens would already be nesting on. And it's actually in that last section that we've seen progress in the last 10 years. That's where voluntary efforts by our landowners, by our producers, have made a difference and have led to what has been noted as sustainable growth in the population. And that we can continue to do. It's the first 2 that give us areas for concern, because the only way to really prevent the power of the almighty dollar is through some policy changes. And the best modeling that scientists have now say that that won't change unless something else does. Now, I'm not saying how to do that. I'm just saying that's what the science is on the table. And I know there was a question that was asked when we had the informal discussion. I just wanted to have a chance to answer that, and it was, why should we care about the lesser prairie chicken dying? And there's a few reasons for that. The first one is that the lesser prairie chicken is the canary in the coal mine. As the lesser prairie chicken dies, it's signaling to us that our grasslands are dying and going away. We manage that 18,000 acre ranch. It's profitably managed. It's grazed with bison, cattle. It makes money. So the more lesser prairie chickens we have, the more money we turn out making. And so the lesser prairie chicken decline is a direct economic concern for Kansas. It's also loss of biodiversity is bad for the health of both the grassland ecosystem and our ecosystem at large. If you ever had a purebred dog, it's more likely to have health issues, more likely to get sick. It doesn't have biodiversity. We need biodiversity to sustain long-term global health. And the last thing is that it's just good stewardship on behalf of Kansans to look out for the species that we have domain over, that we can control their life. And it's what I would say is the right thing to do, to be concerned about them. All that being said, I've heard a lot of great things about voluntary incentivized conservation, which is what the Nature Conservancy loves to hear. That's what we do. And so I look forward to hopefully turning some of the suggestions we heard today into actionable policy and taking it to the future. I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Any questions for Justin? Representative Minix.
This is not a question. Young man, you just did an awesome job of testifying, and I want to thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Very good. Okay. Anything else? All right. Very good. Thank you. Is there anyone else to testify neutral to this resolution? That's all I had on the list. Is there anyone else that wishes to testify on any of these, if you arrived late? I see no hands. I believe all our presenters are also still in the audience. Are there any questions for them to bring them up? Last chance. All right. So with that, we will close the hearing on SCR 1602. It's the chairman's prerogative to suspend the rules, and we will go to final action on SCR 1602. What is the prerogative of the committee? Representative Moser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that we pass SCR 1602 favorably out of committee.
Seconded by Jacobs. Any discussion? Representative Hsu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just as a point of order, do we need a motion first to suspend the rule and then to take this up?
I don't know. Chairman's prerogative. It's Chairman's prerogative just to go ahead and suspend the rules without it, so yes. So we have a motion and a second. Any other discussion? Signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. Okay. The reason why we did that is it will now move through the process, and then we will take it up on the floor later this week, since the Senate has already done it. So that is the reason for the quick action. Okay. So thank you for that. Now tomorrow, it is Conservation Day here in the Capitol, so kind of a conservation theme so far this session. So we will have the chairman of the Kansas Association of Conservation Districts, as well as the Sorghum Improvement Center, come and do presentations for us tomorrow. There will be no bills attached to this. It is simply to give us all an idea of what is going on here in the state with both conservation as well as some of the innovative things they're doing with sorghum at K-State. And then also on Thursday, we will have a briefing by the new exec of the Kansas State Fair with an update there. So any of those, bring your questions. Anything else for the good of the cause? What? Oh, well, does anyone want your vote recorded? We'll go back there. You are a no, is that correct? Yes. Okay. Representative Schlingen-Siepen, no. No pause. Representative Featherston, no. Do you have a comment? All right. Anybody else want their vote recorded? Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Representative Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to tell you thank you for the presentation on Thursday. I found it very, very informative, so I appreciate you taking that time and that request.
Absolutely. Thank you all, whoever's reaching out to him. He has reached out again, so I know he's getting some comments from not only here, but others that were paying it, kind of watching it and so on. And so if you weren't here and didn't get your book, talk to Terry. Have you distributed them? You have. Okay, that's what happens when you're 5 minutes late to your own committee. Saying that again, that is it for today. We will see you tomorrow at 3:30. We are adjourned.